Enhance vision. Empower life. Vision Care.
United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights Michelle Bachelet puts forth 22 recommendations for the Sri Lankan government, the Human Rights Council and member states, as well as other United Nations entities, in her report on the country's human rights performance to be tabled before the February 24 country review at the 46th session of the UNHRC. In it, Bachelet concludes that Sri Lanka's current trajectory sets the scene for the recurrence of the policies and practices that gave rise to grave human rights violations. It says that Tamil and Muslim minorities are being increasingly marginalized and excluded from the national vision and government policy. Another conclusion of Bachelet is that the emergency security deployment that followed the Easter Sunday terrorist attacks in 2019 have evolved into an increasing militarization of the state and takes aim at the government's appointment of active and former military personnel, including those what the report calls are credibly implicated in war crimes, to key positions in the civilian administration. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights also alleges that the space for civil society, including independent media, is rapidly shrinking. The report says that the government has now demonstrated its inability and unwillingness to pursue a meaningful path towards accountability for international crimes and serious human rights violations, and signalled instead a fundamentally different approach which focuses on reparation and development but threatens to deny victims their rights to truth and justice and further entrench impunity. Bachelet goes on to say that in addition to taking steps towards a referral of the situation in Sri Lanka to the International Criminal Court, member states can actively pursue investigation and prosecution of international crimes committed by all parties in Sri Lanka before their own national courts, including under accepted principles of extraterritorial or universal jurisdiction. She concludes that the member states can also apply targeted sanctions such as asset freezes and travel bans against state officials and other actors credibly alleged to have committed or be responsible for grave human rights violations or abuses. Among her 11 recommendations to the Sri Lankan government, Bachelet calls for removal from office security personnel and other public officials who the report identifies as credibly implicated in human rights violations in compliance with human rights standards. She also calls for a moratorium on the use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act for new arrests until it is replaced by legislation that adheres to international best practices. Establishment of standard procedures for the granting of pardons or other forms of clemency by the President, including subjecting it to judicial review and excluding grave human rights and international humanitarian law violations, is also recommended. Meanwhile, among Bachelet's 7 recommendations laid out for the Human Rights Council and member states, she requests the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights to enhance its monitoring of the human rights situation in Sri Lanka. What's more, she calls for stringent vetting procedures to Sri Lankan police and military personnel identified for military exchanges and training programs. Prioritization of support to civil society initiatives and efforts for reparation and victims' assistance, and prioritization of victims and their families for assistance in their bilateral humanitarian, development and scholarship programs is another recommendation. In the meantime, a total of 4 recommendations are made by UN Human Rights Commissioner Michelle Bachelet for United Nations entities. She wants UN agencies to ensure that all development programs in Sri Lanka are founded on principles of inclusion, non-discrimination and support for effective, accountable and inclusive institutions in line with the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Incorporation of strict human rights due diligence in engagement with the security forces and all bodies under the purview of the Ministry of Defence or the Ministry of Public Security is also recommended. In the last recommendation, Bachelet notes that whilst fully understanding fourth-generation challenges in the context of UN peacekeeping, keep under review Sri Lanka's contributions to UN peacekeeping operations and screening systems for Sri Lanka personnel.
In other legal stories, Transparency International Sri Lanka is critical of the fact that Sri Lanka stagnated at the rank of 92 for a decade in the Corruption Perception Index. Addressing a media briefing today, its executive director also said that the COVID-19 vaccination program is at high risk of falling prey to corruption owing to the considerable flow of funds involved.
In this Corruption Perception Index of 2020, Sri Lanka has scored 38 out of 100, and our ranking among 180 countries is the 92nd place. And it is disheartening to note that Sri Lanka's score, this 38th score, has remained stagnant at this level for almost a decade. Over the past decade, we have successive governments who have pledged to work towards eradicating corruption, and which means there has not been real change for all these efforts, which is why the experts and the private sector are still perceiving the public sector to have a high level of corruption. If we look at the initiative of the Commission to investigate allegations of bribery and corruption, in 2019 launched the National Action Plan to eradicate corruption with a lot of consultations and very good recommendations, but we have not seen the progress of this National Action Plan. It had crucial elements such as bringing a legal framework to regulate campaign financing, which is where the story begins. And we do not see that commitment from the necessary stakeholders. And in terms of the recent policies such as no questions asked to deposit foreign currency, now these factors will affect the CPI or the Corruption Perception Index next year as well in our country. Now we hear that people are questioning what happened to all the COVID relief funds that we got. I think the fact that people are asking questions is a good thing, and it doesn't mean there is corruption, but it gives that space and opportunity for the government to inculcate and nurture a culture of transparency. If you look at the vaccination, it's going to be a high risk for corruption area with a lot of funds coming in.
ආයුෂ් කරාබු නැටි දන්තාලේපය ශක්තිමත් දත් දෙපළකට